Hello, I'm Pastor Marilyn from Forsyth Presbyterian Church and Ukirk Campus Ministry at Mercer University.
And I'm Pastor Joseph from Culpeper Presbyterian Church.
Welcome to our Lenten sermon and discussion series, From the Cup to the Cross.
This series focuses on Matthew's account of Jesus' journey from the cup to the cross, which can be found in chapters 26 and 27 of Matthew's Gospel. In church circles, this three-day period is often called the triduum.
If you need a refresher on our previous week's discussions, I encourage you to check out our other videos on this playlist. These stories are part of an ongoing narrative, so each video does build on the previous ones.
Once again, we're dealing with a longer section of Scripture this week. And this week we'll reach the cross, and Jesus drinks the cup, which he prayed be taken away at Gethsemane, pouring out his blood of the covenant in his painful death.
If you want to know more about Jesus' experience on the cross, the resources are plentiful, and we'll be happy to recommend some to you, but as we examine Matthew's account of this story, we find relatively few details about Jesus' suffering. One commentator observed that what details are given concern not the victim, but the spectators. Our study focuses on the communities accompanying Christ to the cross, so we'll follow the gospel writer's lead and focus on those who surrounded the scene.
While there are a variety of ways to group these folks, a community is a distinctive thing. And I see three main communities: the occupiers, the collaborators, and the disciples.
We'll start with the occupiers. The Romans living in Judea are their own community. They likely came from all across the empire and converged on Jerusalem to extend and preserve imperial power. In this passage, we see them first in the soldiers who mock Jesus, and then in those who crucify him, divide and gamble for his clothes, and keep watch while he dies. They are following orders and dividing the spoils.
We also see that the occupiers clearly label Jesus as the King of the Jews. Again, this community is built to extend and preserve his imperial power. And in adding this sign, the Romans intend further mockery of Jesus, but they are likely also mocking the Jews as a subject people, as in, this naked bloody fool is the best you could do? The community which occupies Jerusalem wants those who witness the crucifixion to know that the power is Rome's. But keep watch on these characters, because as they keep watch over the crucifixion, they will be transformed by their experience.
Just as those occupying Jerusalem have become their own community, those who live under occupation are also a distinct community. This specific group of collaborators either seek or tolerate the crucifixion of Jesus.
Like the soldiers, they join in the mockery. The chief priests and elders of the people who have been part of the story almost since the beginning again make an appearance specifically to say that he saved others and he cannot save himself.
Interestingly, even the bandit rebels crucified with Jesus are in this community of collaborators. Where we would expect solidarity among victims of imperial execution, we instead get derision.
Matthew doesn't tell us why they collaborate with the soldiers, passers-by, and elders and chief priests to mock Jesus as he's crucified. Perhaps the bandits resent Jesus' preaching peace rather than supporting their militant opposition to Roman rule. We can only guess what they were thinking as they taunted him.
What we can see in this passage is that the collaborator community is so committed to making sure that this Roman execution fits their plans that they go to Pilate the next day to ask that Jesus' tomb be placed under guard.
The collaborators work on the Sabbath with the occupiers to keep Jesus in the tomb and stifle the disciples.
The third community is the disciples. While the men in Jesus' inner circle have completely disappeared for this part of the story, the women form a remnant of the collapsed community of disciples. Those who ministered to Jesus as he ministered to everyone else performed their last ministry to him in this life, faithfully bearing witness to his suffering and death.
Matthew tells us that Joseph of Arimathea was a rich man and a disciple of Jesus. He has a new tomb near Jerusalem which he gives to Jesus, treating Jesus' body with loving care and respect.
While the women and Joseph of Arimathea are already disciples, Christ's crucifixion brings new sympathizers into the reforming community. Simon of Cyrene appears for the first time in Matthew when the Romans compel him to carry Christ's cross. The Romans had the power to conscript anyone in occupied Judea into nearly any type of service, and this particular one would have been humiliating and terrifying.
Christ's crucifixion also moves the aforementioned centurion and his soldiers toward the community of disciples. In fact, they become the first Gentiles to proclaim a truth they don't fully understand. Truly, this man was God's son.
The community of disciples has collapsed, but at the cross, these witnesses, bystanders, and sympathizers begin to reform that community.
This reformed community of disciples centers around the shared encounter with Christ crucified. And each particular perspective means something different to those who encountered Christ in this moment.
For the women, encountering the crucified Christ means bearing witness to the suffering of the world in defiant hope that that suffering does not get the last word. We see their transformation in the resurrection story which follows. Their experience of Christ crucified moves them from supporting characters to main cast as they become the first witnesses of Jesus' resurrection and proclaim that gospel news to the other disciples.
For Joseph of Arimathea, encountering the crucified Christ means sacrificing pride, connection, social respect, and influence to restore the dignity of a convicted criminal through an honorable burial.
For Simon from Cyrene, encountering the crucified Christ means moving from a bystander brutalized by Roman occupation and moving toward a Christ-centered community.
For both Simon of Cyrene and Joseph of Arimathea, we can infer that they were also transformed by their experience of Christ crucified and chose to remain so close to this reforming community of disciples that their names and hometowns are remembered and recorded in a gospel that's written 30 to 60 years later.
For the centurion and his soldiers, encountering the crucified Christ means seeing God in a man who died at their superior's command and by their own hands. They are unique in this story in that we immediately see the effects of their experience. Transformed by what they witness, they move from mocking Jesus to testifying that truly this man was God's son.
Each of these characters encounters Christ's crucifixion in a different way, and they are changed by their experience. An encounter with Christ crucified will not leave a person unchanged. For people who wonder if their faith in Jesus Christ has anything to do with their public life, this scripture teaches us to consider the ways in which Jesus encourages us to move outside of the private nature of our faith to consider the public implication of God's love and radical inclusion. No longer are the disciples known by their Galilean accent. The crucifixion reforms the disciples of Jesus into a global and intersectional community.
And that community, our community, transformed by our own encounters with Christ, crucified and raised, seeks to transform the world around us. We refuse to give death and destruction the last word. We keep hope in the face of despair, and we keep proclaiming the good news.
Now, we're getting ready to pass this conversation off to either your discussion groups or your personal reflections. But as a closing word, I'd like to thank my own collaborator, Pastor Marilyn, for her input and guidance as we worked on this together. I also want to thank the people who are Forsyth Presbyterian Church and UKirk Campus Ministry at Mercer University for joining us as we explored these chapters together over the past few weeks. My own discipleship has grown as a result of this study, and sharing it with Pastor Marilyn and the communities with whom she ministers has been an indescribable gift. I know I'll be watching the live stream of Forsyth's Easter service so I can see how your community celebrates the final day of the triduum.
I'm grateful for this experience of walking the road of Jesus' final days with you, Pastor Joseph, and with our communities of Culpeper, Forsyth, and UKirk. This story holds the challenge of trauma, pain, disappointment, anguish, and death, but it also holds hope and good news I would never see without encountering it as part of a community. The process of this study and sermon series has reaffirmed for me that our work, our ministry, our theology is stronger, better, and more joyful when we practice it in community. I look forward to hearing how our neighbors up in Culpeper celebrate the good news of Easter morning.
He is not here.
He is risen.
He is risen indeed.